Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a really fascinating historical document. It gives us this snapshot of East Asia, specifically China and Japan, back in the early 20th century.
And importantly, it's through a Western lens. So we're looking at how these nations were perceived at, well, a really pivotal time.
Exactly. They were dealing with huge internal changes, loads of external pressure, trying to figure out their place in the world.
Our mission today is basically to unpack this specific source, see the world through its eyes, and understand the big questions it was raising about economics, politics, culture.
Right, because this isn't just history for history's sake. This source, it offers this unique window. It helps us trace the roots of dynamics we still see today.
And it kind of forces us to think about our own assumptions, doesn't it? About different societies, what progress means.
Yeah, it subtly asks if the Western path was or is the only way.
It's a very specific viewpoint from a specific moment in time, rich with observations, anecdotes.
Okay, so let's dive in. Where does the source start with China? Before the big Western impact really hit full force.
Well, it kicks off by acknowledging China's incredible history. We're talking thousands of years, these cycles of dynasties rising and falling, periods of strength, then chaos, then a new power-restoring order.
Like the Han Dynasty or the Tang, big eras.
Right. And the source even notes something interesting about the name China itself. It might actually come from the Qin or Xin family Shi Huangti, the first emperor.
The one who really clamped down on feudalism and unified things.
Exactly. The source highlights him, but then it quickly moves on to what it sees as the truly distinctive things about traditional Chinese civilization, what really set it apart.
Okay, what are those key features according to this source?
It singles out three main things. First up, the writing system. Using ideograms, these characters representing whole ideas, not just sounds like our alphabet.
The characters, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, and the source presents it as quite profound. It even quotes a Chinese writer suggesting that maybe alphabetic languages are less stable for conveying deep truths compared to the solid ideas in Chinese characters.
Wow, that's a big claim.
It is, and while the source acknowledges the practical need for phonetic writing, for education and literacy, which was super hard with thousands of characters.
Right, limited who could read and write.
Totally, but the source speculates, and it's just speculation, that maybe this ideographic system is somehow linked to why Chinese civilization was so stable for so long.
Language structure influencing societal resilience. That's something to think about. What's the second point?
The role of Confucianism, especially for the educated class, the literati. The source clear. This wasn't religion as Westerners understood it. No focus on personal salvation or strict dogma.
So more about how to live well here. How society should function.
Precisely. It was a code of ethics, all about good government, social relationships, filial piety, that deep respect for elders and ancestors, duty to your neighbor, reverence for spiritual stuff, but with some reserve.
And this ethic apparently influenced everything, even war.
Yeah, the source argues it shaped the administration, the bureaucracy, and even made warfare, maybe less brutal than in Europe at times. Less focused on total annihilation.
Interesting. And that connects to the third point, I guess.
Yeah.
Government by scholars.
Absolutely. The examination system. Instead of lords inheriting power, you had officials chosen through these intense exams based on Confucian classics and literary skill.
That system lasted for ages, right? Until the early 1900s.
Until 1905, yeah. The source notes it became rigid later on, that whole eight legs essay style people had to master, maybe stifling originality.
Okay.
But its purpose, its foundation was revolutionary compared to European aristocracy. Theoretically, merit, or at least scholarly ability, was the path up.
Meritocracy through exams. Very different.
Very. The source also touches on the family system, filial piety again, calls it important, but maybe less uniquely Chinese than the other 3 points, arguing most societies went through a similar stage.
But it does draw a contrast there with Japan.
It does. It points out how Confucian ethics could justify resisting a bad emperor in China, whereas in Japan, the Mikado demanded this sort of absolute worship. And then there's this provocative little aside. The source suggests that maybe excessive patriotism, which was a growing force then, could actually be more harmful than too much focus on the family.
Wow, that's counterintuitive today, maybe.
It certainly makes you think. And finally, on traditional China, the source just flags the difficulty of getting good population numbers. Estimates varied wildly over the centuries.
Right. Figures from maybe 55 million up to over 300 million.
Yeah.
Hard to know for sure.
Exactly. No reliable birth or death rates. A lot of it was guesswork, which tells you something about the state's reach, maybe.
A vast, ancient civilization, hard to even count, facing this incoming tide from the West.
And that's the next big chapter, the Western impact.
Which the source says wasn't exactly a gentle arrival.
No, not at all. The source is blunt. Western powers showed up with superior firepower. China was defeated in wars like the Opium Wars, and that's what forced it to open its ports and eventually its mind to the West.
And this opening came with serious costs to China's independence, right?
Huge costs. The source spells out how sovereignty was eroded. The big one was the customs tariff.
Ah, yes, this is pretty shocking.
Treaties imposed this fixed, low tariff, just 5% on imports way back in 1842. And the killer was, to change it, you needed unanimous agreement from 13 foreign powers.
13 nations had a veto over China's trade policy.
Basically, yes. It completely hamstrung them economically. They couldn't protect new industries, couldn't raise revenue from imports easily like any other sovereign state.
So much for the open door policy we hear about.
Well, the source suggests that policy, while maybe stopping one power from grabbing everything, didn't really help China regain control. And worse, the revenue China did collect from things like customs or the salt tax
Was often pledged away.
exactly mortgaged to pay for foreign loans and war indemnities. The source even mentions telegrams showing foreign officials interfering when the Chinese government tried to manage its own money. Real loss of fiscal control.
And then there were the spheres of influence.
Yeah, Britain, Russia, France, Germany. They carved up parts of China where they had special privileges, pushing for railway concessions, mining rights, often by lending money to weak local Chinese authorities.
A kind of informal colonization.
You could see it that way. It created this patchwork of foreign power centers inside China. And all this external pressure, it seems, made the internal situation even worse.
The source describes basically anarchy.
Pretty much. It talks about the Tuchen system, these regional military governors, warlords really. They ignored the central government in Peking, lived off the land, intercepted taxes, except the ones the foreigners controlled, like customs.
So the central government was broke and powerless while these generals ran their own areas.
Leading to constant civil war. North versus south, different generals fighting each other. The source even says that in the north, there wasn't really a proper de jure government, one recognized by law. Just chaos.
But people were trying to find a way forward. Political movements.
Yeah, the source mentions Sun Yat-sen down in Canton trying to establish a rival government, and military figures like Wu Peifu who sometimes gained popular support.
And foreign powers played a role in their success or failure.
Oh, absolutely. Getting foreign backing or avoiding foreign opposition was often key. The source points to student protests in 1920 backing Wu Peifu against a pro-Japanese faction as a sign of maybe a new kind of political force emerging.
Students getting involved.
Yeah, and the source kind of hopes that maybe the constitutionalists could unite, find a general willing to give up military force and restore some kind of order. A bit of wishful thinking, perhaps.
Let's shift focus a bit from politics to people. The source offers observations on Chinese character, right? Challenges stereotypes.
It does. It directly tackles that old Western idea of the inscrutable Chinese. Shares this nice anecdote.
Yeah.
The author says, ask a Chinese person for train times, you might get a vague answer, but ask about local history or culture, you get this passionate, detailed explanation. It's not inscrutability, it's just different priorities.
That's a great way to put it. What positive traits does the source highlight?
Things like a quiet dignity, a lack of pushiness individually or nationally, deep pride, though. A generally peaceful nature, the author notes, they don't seem to admire killing efficiency.
Huh, okay.
Also, a love of compromise, finding the middle way, and a real respect for public opinion mentions a teacher's strike influencing officials. Plus, urbanity, politeness, and intellectual honesty, a willingness to admit faults.
Sounds pretty positive overall, but it mentions negatives too.
It does. Avarice, or greed, is noted as a common issue, linked to seeing money as the main path to enjoyment. This fueled corruption, the source says, and made laborers risk their lives for tiny sums.
Okay, what else?
Cowardice is mentioned, though maybe less common and possibly linked to that avarice. And then there's callousness. This apparently really struck the author, an Anglo-Saxon.
Callousness. like indifference to suffering.
Yeah, and things like famine response or treatment of animals. The source tries to rationalize it. Partly the sheer scale of problems like famine in China could numb people, perhaps. But it admits there's a residue that's hard for a Westerner to understand.
Hmm. Difficult territory. But then the source makes this quite bold comparison between China and the West.
It really does. It argues quite strikingly that China's outlook might be fundamentally more humane and civilized than the West's, potentially leading to more happiness, even with less material wealth.
More humane. How so?
It contrasts their approach to business, less focused on grabbing monopolies or concessions, apparently, and their attitude towards what the West called progress. It suggests the Chinese valued wealth for enjoyment, while the West valued power and ruthlessness more.
Leading to different kinds of ambition.
Yeah, and maybe, paradoxically, more individual freedom. The source argues that even under a weak or corrupt Chinese government, there might have been more personal liberty than in a highly organized, efficient Western state.
Wow. Weak government equals more freedom. That really flips the usual script.
It's definitely one of the source's most thought-provoking points. Makes you question what efficient government actually means for individual lives.
Okay, so that's the picture of China. Now, Japan. The source presents its reaction to the West as completely different.
Almost the mirror image, yeah. Instead of China's sort of slow, painful, often resistant engagement, Japan made a conscious choice. Fight the West with its own weapons, meaning rapid wholesale adoption of Western models. Get a modern army like the Germans, a navy like the British, factories and machines like the Americans, and, the source adds wryly, modern morals copied from the whole lot.
This is tied to the Meiji Restoration starting around 1867.
Yes, but the source clarifies it wasn't just about putting the emperor, the Mikado, back in nominal charge after centuries of shogun rule. It was really about transferring power to specific powerful clans, Satsuma, Choshu.
And they used history to justify this power shift.
Kind of. They looked back to ancient models like a 7th century constitution to legitimize centralizing power and curbing the old feudal lords. The source compares it to how European monarchs like Louis XI consolidated power.
So politically, the emperor becomes this absolute figurehead.
Absolute ruler on paper after 1868, yeah. And deliberately cultivated as an object of intense worship in schools. He became this incredibly powerful symbol of nationalism.
But the source suggests a gap between the symbol and the reality.
Oh, yeah. It stresses the difference between the Mikado's nominal power and the real power held by the oligarchs and ministers behind the scenes. They answered to the emperor, not the new parliament, the Diet, which had very limited influence. Prince Ito, a key figure, framed it that way.
And this political makeover came with a cultural one, too, using religion.
Exactly. The state deliberately promoted Shinto, which the source calls a primitive nature cult, over the more established Buddhism. Why? To boost Mikado worship. It became the bedrock of patriotism, tying loyalty to the emperor directly into traditional ideas of filial piety.
So manufacturing a state ideology, basically.
That's how the source presents it. A somewhat forced cultural shift, suppressing free thought and criticism along the way. Modernization, but very much top-down, state-controlled.
And driven by practical needs, too. Population growth.
Big time. Japan's population was growing rapidly, but unlike Europe, people weren't emigrating much, so they needed industry to support everyone.
And industry needs resources, which links to foreign policy.
Directly. The need for raw materials, especially from China, combined with this intense state-sponsored nationalism, fueled an expansionist foreign policy. But this required a huge military.
Which caused money and created hardship at home.
Right. The source points to poverty among industrial workers, rising discontent, the beginnings of socialist and labor movements, a real tension bubbling beneath the surface.
So foreign aggression driven by economics and ideology, but creating internal problems.
Exactly. And the source sees this tension as fundamental. The official morality is all about patriotism, emperor worship, filial piety. But the reality is industrial hardship and growing dissent. The only escape, the source argues, is reducing the birth rate, but that clashed with militarist ideas about national strength and religious views.
A real bind. So this aggressive foreign policy, tell us more about that.
Well, the source details Japan grabbing spheres of influence Manchuria, initially Shantung controlling railways, often using loans or, the source alleges, secret deals, all driven by that mix of economic necessity and nationalist ambition.
And then the 21 demands in 1915. That was a big moment.
Huge. Made while Europe was busy with World War I, these demands would have essentially made China a Japanese protectorate, total economic control, locking out other powers.
How did the West react?
Initially, not strongly enough, according to the source. Britain, especially, was tied down in the war. America did make diplomatic protests, though.
And Japan also maneuvered during the war regarding China's involvement.
Yeah, the source describes intrigues where Japan basically tried to control whether China joined the Allies, and crucially, secured secret promises from Britain and France to support Japan's claims on Germany's former rights in China's Shantung province after the war.
Which is what happened at Versailles.
Pretty much. Japan got the German rights in Shantung, which sparked massive outrage and protests in China, that student movement we talked about earlier, a real flashpoint for Chinese nationalism.
But didn't Japan later give up Shantung?
Nominally, yes, at the Washington Conference in the early 1920s, mostly due to American pressure. But the source is skeptical, suggesting Japan just looked for compensation elsewhere, like in its dealings with Russia. The expansionist drive wasn't really stopped, just maybe redirected.
Japan's relationships with the big powers seem key here. The Anglo-Japanese alliance.
The source explains its original purpose, helping Japan fight Russia, which actually suited Britain at the time, as paved the way for Britain and Russia to become friendlier later. But the source argues strongly that ending that alliance was needed for Japan to reform internally.
And relations with Russia after the war they won.
Surprisingly friendly for a while until the Bolshevik Revolution changed everything. But the growing conflict, the source says, was with America.
Why America?
Economic rivalry, sure, but also fundamentally different ideas. The source puts it starkly. Japan's divine right of kings versus America's divine right of commerce. Deep ideological clash.
And the source feared war between them.
Very much so. Called it a terrible thing that Japan would likely lose, potentially wrecking its civilization and leaving China vulnerable. The source desperately hoped war could be avoided, maybe if Japan became more liberal, perhaps pushed by diplomatic failures like at Washington.
What about the new player? Bolshevik Russia?
The source sees them as a potential wild card in the Far East, maybe appealing to younger Chinese nationalists as a force against Western imperialism.
But not necessarily a good model for China.
Right. The source is skeptical about Bolshevism as an ideology fitting China. Too much state control, too anti-trade, maybe too much government for Chinese tastes, which historically prefer, less intrusion, but as a political force against the West, potentially appealing.
A complex picture. Let's swing back to China's own potential. Its economy.
The source acknowledges China has the raw materials, lots of coal and iron, key for industry.
And industry was starting.
Yes, textiles, shipbuilding, mining. But fledgling, and often under foreign control, especially Japanese investment in mines, and conditions were grim, low wages, long hours.
But there were signs of Chinese capability.
Definitely. The source makes a point of saying that railways built and run by the Chinese themselves were often managed really well, like the line to Kalgan. Better, sometimes, than the lines run by foreign concessions. It saw that as proof the potential was there.
So the capability existed, but needed the right conditions.
Exactly. The source strongly argues China needs industrial development under its own control for independence and prosperity. But this requires changes internally. More public spirit, honesty in government beyond just family loyalty, tackling corruption, more energy for big projects.
Which connects to culture and education, presumably.
For sure. The source notes this real hunger for Western learning in China. Not just to be strong, but because knowledge itself is traditionally valued. Lots of students went abroad.
Especially to America.
Yeah, partly because America used its share of the Boxer indemnity funds to pay for scholarships. Smart move, maybe.
And these return students became important.
Hugely important. They came back as teachers, journalists, officials, bringing modern ideas. But the source notes the goal wasn't just to copy the West.
What was the goal then?
The hope among many educated Chinese, according to the source, was to create a new blend. Take Western science and technical skills, but combine them with the best of traditional Chinese virtues and philosophy.
A synthesis. Sounds ambitious. Were there challenges?
Oh, yeah. Lack of money for universities, not enough libraries, maybe not enough rigorous mental discipline yet in higher education compared to the West. But the source is also incredibly positive about the raw material, calls the students The finest human material with a profoundly humanistic attitude.
Interesting. It mentions a potential downside to studying abroad, though.
A little bit, that students might come back with the stamp of America or Britain or wherever, creating divisions. So developing strong Chinese universities, integrating Western knowledge on their own terms, was seen as crucial. Tsinghua College, funded by U.S. money, is mentioned as efficient but maybe less humanistic than older Chinese styles.
And the student movement, like in 1919 against the Versailles decision.
That's held up as a really powerful example, proof of a rising public spirit. Students influencing politics, boycotting Japanese goods, even doing social work like setting up free schools. And the source notes men and women were involved equally in this modern movement. Quite striking for the time.
So wrapping up, what's the source's final feeling about China's future? Hopeful, cautious.
Both, I'd say. There's this recurring hope for a genuinely new, maybe better civilization than the West had produced. If China isn't driven to militarism by foreign pressure or its own nationalism.
It sees potential greatness, but also danger.
Yeah, potential to be a great power. But the worry is that patriotism, then focused on just achieving independence, could become aggressive once China is strong.
So independence isn't the end goal, but the means to create this better society.
That's exactly how the source frames it. Independence is necessary to allow this blend of old virtues and new skills to flourish. But it concludes by saying China really needs inspiring leaders and a clear idea shared among its people of what kind of civilization they actually want to build.
Wow. We've really unpacked a lot there. The deep roots of traditional China described by the source, the often damaging impact of the West, Japan's very different driven modernization path, the chaos inside China, but also these glimmers of new movements.
And that constant thread of the source, seeing things through its early 20th century Western perspective, yet still offering these, sometimes surprising insights and hopes, especially for China.
Yeah, looking through this specific lens really does highlight how these historical dynamics, sovereignty, culture clashes, economic ambitions are still echoing today, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It shows how the past shapes the present and how perspectives shape our understanding of that past.
It really does. And thinking about the source's hope for that new blend in China, but also its fear of aggressive patriotism.
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it?
It does. And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listener. Thinking about China's continued rise today, what parts of its ancient culture and character, maybe like those described in this old source, do you think are most valuable for it to hold on to? And maybe how can the world encourage that positive blend the source hoped for, instead of, well, pushing towards the kind of pugnacity it warned about over a century ago? Something to mull over.